that we have. So just by way of introduction, um, I am from BDO Cyberlab. My name is Shannon DuPont. I'm the Associate Director there. And welcome to the Black Swan event. This is the second one that we're hosting as BDO. And just basically the aim of this is to, provide a current status of cyber and or challenges with possible solutions or topics that we see trending or of interest. As I said, I'm from BDO Cyberlab. You can see our service offering there. We do a number of things within the cyber industry, whether that be assurance or advisory work. And just on the structure of today's session, we have four speakers from our partners, obviously very experienced people with great expertise in the cyber industry. We will be doing 20 minutes for each presentation and 5 minutes at the end of each for a bit of Q&A. You can drop your questions in the chat, and yeah, we'll be able to answer from there. Just as I said, this is the agenda. Those are the different topics, but I'll just go into each of the speakers. So first up will be Ronnie Koch from Blue Turtle. He'll be discussing third-party cyber risk management. He's an engineering graduate who's been involved in ICT for the past 40 years. He's done a lot of work. Varied work experience includes real-time programming in assembler cybersecurity, and has nearly 12 years as a specialist, storage area network, Cisco data instructor, and has refocused on his love for cybersecurity on and off since 1995. So he'll be discussing third-party cyber risk management. Very interesting topic. We see a lot of breaches occurring because of third parties. And that will be from 9:15 to around 20 to 10. Next up, we have Simeon from Galix. Simeon is the managing director of Galix for over 25 years. Galix assists by partnering with different organizations and their management to be a security partner and helping them to manage and improve their IT infrastructure and cybersecurity. Just as far as the PCI DSS goes, he obtained certification as a qualified security assessor, which certifies him to conduct PCI DSS assessment audits. And you can see there's a wealth of qualifications there: CISSP, PCIP, CISA, CDPSE, CPSA. And he will be discussing PCI DSS compliance. So for those of you interested in that, I think this will also be a very valuable topic in terms of, and also, what services they provide around this. That should be from 20 to 10 to about 5:10. Next will be Ryan from Darktrace. He's the cybersecurity account executive there. He has been at Darktrace, if I'm not mistaken, for the past 3 years. And has worked with a number of companies through Africa. He'll be discussing trending attack techniques in Africa that they're seeing for 2023, and that'll be from 10:10 to around 25 to 11. And then lastly will be Nick from INSEOX. He'll be discussing a new lens over cyber risk. He's a director at INSEOX, which is a risk management business consultancy that provides innovative solutions to tackle digital risk. He founded INSEOX in 2020 with his leadership team. He's responsible for offering businesses a unique data-driven approach to identify, understand, and manage their cyber-human risk. And he does this in partnership with Outthink. Prior to this, he served at Deloitte for over 15 years. He's done work in the UK and SA offices across various risk advisory offerings such as cyber and technology risk, IT assurance, internal audits, and forensics. Almost sounds like me, except for the forensics. And yeah, that will be the four speakers. As I said, myself, I'm your host. This is the agenda. Just going back to that, we'll have a break around 5:10 to around 10:10, so that we can, look to be done by 11. So I didn't want to spend too much time on my portion, which was supposed to be from 9 to 9:15, because obviously we had some of these technical difficulties. So I will be then handing over to Ronnie from Blue Turtle.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Shannon. We're going to talk about third-party cyber risk management in the shadow of Black Swan. Now, the challenge with Black Swan events are that they're very difficult, or, well, by definition, they're impossible to predict. So what we're looking at is what we can do to prepare ourselves for these kind of events. When we look at today's organization, and thanks to digital transformation that was accelerated during the pandemic times, we are very dependent. Most organizations are dependent on other organizations to fulfill their functions. We can think of logistics, payment processes, etc. And the research has shown that 70% of organizations have a moderate to high dependency on external organizations. And again, 83% of organizations have experienced a third-party incident in the past 3 years. And that is fairly dramatic. So to kind of give us introduction to this, I thought what we do is take a trip down memory lane and look at certain third-party cyber incidents that happened in the past couple of years, the past decade or so, and then also look at these and understand where a cyber event with a third party in your supply chain can impact organizations in various ways. In some cases, even impacting on the physical operations of the business. And the first one I want to look at is Target. Now, Target is a very nice one to talk about simply because of their logo. That looks like a Target. Now, Target was breached via a supplier that looked after the maintenance for their heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. Research has shown that this supplier didn't even meet the basic requirements or didn't pay attention to even the basic requirements as far as cybersecurity is concerned. This supplier was breached, surprise, surprise, and then this authorized access into the Target environment was then used, and a huge amount of data was exfiltrated before they became aware of this intrusion. What can we learn from this? Well, I think the first thing that we need to think about is, would it have helped if Target paid attention to the third-party security posture of that specific vendor? And my contention is yes, that would have helped. Just working with that vendor, that supplier, and making sure that at least they have the basics in place would certainly have made a difference. And then also, in modern day parlance, we talk about zero trust. But even in those days, things like multi-factor authentication, things like no standing privileges, minimum access, all those kind of things would have helped Target to prevent this breach. Moving on to another one that in fairly recent history, the SolariGate, the SolarWinds supply chain compromise. This was a lot more sophisticated than the previous one. Sophisticated threat actors reached SolarWinds, one of the entities within the SolarWinds group, and put a very sophisticated compromise that ended up with one of the Orion modules for the network management tool was compromised. Interestingly, the threat actors were very patient. They waited for the intended victims to actually bring this Trojan horse into their own environment, very similar to the original Trojan horse of history. And when this was activated, they also showed a lot of restraint and only went after their target market to not make, or their target victims, I guess is the market when you're a threat actor, their target victims and not everybody that was compromised by this malicious piece of code. Thereby diminishing the chances of accidental discovery of this compromise. Now, in this case, would it have helped if we looked at the supply chain? And the interesting thing is that if you look historically at that time when the compromise happened, there was definitely indications that the security posture of certain entities within the SolarWinds group was not up to standard. Incidentally, exactly where the compromise happened. Would any organization have taken that as a reason not to use the Orion software tool? And I don't think they would have. If you look at the companies that were compromised in the end, it's like a who's who of the industry. It is well-known logos that we all recognize globally. And would a small organization, 2,000 people in South Africa, maybe have made a decision not to use the tool based on the security posture of a certain entity within the SolarWinds group? I think not. What could we have done and what should we do in future? Learn from this. Um, uh, this sparked a lot of interest in incoming code analysis, uh, software composition analysis, software bill of materials, other ways of incoming code analysis. I'm not sure how much of that stuck. And I think even today, we still have to kind of think that if this happens again, how do we look after that? And I think maybe even zero trust, minimizing the blast radius would help as well. Although when they go after a tool like a network management tool and other management tools, by definition, it has wide access. All right, let's move on to another one. This one is very similar. We're looking at Maersk shipping lines, and the NotPetya ransomware that turned out not to be ransomware, but wiper software. The compromise started at a small independent software vendor that created an accounting package that became essential for working and doing business inside the Ukraine. And the intended target was businesses in the Ukraine. Unfortunately, many other organizations, including Maersk Shipping Lines, was almost compelled to use this accounting package to do business. And of course, there's a lot of shipping that used to happen in and out of the Ukraine, of the ports on the coast. So therefore, Maersk used that principally only for their regional operations around the Ukraine. But when the ransomware or the malware was activated, the effect of the wiper spread through the whole organization. Essentially, the next morning, they realized that you have no IT systems. And Maersk Shipping Lines was stranded and almost ran aground because of the financial impact of that. Again, if you look at this, to mitigate this, I would say that third-party cyber risk analysis, looking at the posture of that small organization, if you had a regional kind of segmentation in the organization, a regional decision-making, maybe that would have helped. But in this case, I think the biggest problem here was that the malware was able to spread through the whole global organization. So I'd say mitigation, segmentation, and micro-segmentation, and making sure that you have business continuity things in place. AirCap got disaster recovery, immutable backups. I kind of tag this as a black swan event. As I said, third-party cyber risk management probably would not have helped, would not have been able to make the decision, at least at group level. Maybe if we had regional authority to do that, might have helped. I label it as a black swan simply because not because of the ransomware, not because of the wiperware, but because the whole event of just thinking of what happens the next morning if we don't have IT systems. That is something that today, after the fact, we can do in real-time tabletop scenarios, talk about how do we handle this. But I label that as a black swan event simply because it was unthinkable to think of not having IT systems the next morning. And in these three cases, every time a cyber breach at a cyber event at the victims. Another one where there was a ransomware event at a third party. This is a key component supplier for Toyota, making plastic parts. There's no indication that this ransomware spread to Toyota yet, because of the criticality of the supplier with their just-in-time lean manufacturing principles that they follow. It ended up that Toyota shut down 14 production plants in Japan for a whole day. It was only a day, but they lost 13,000 vehicles in that day. So this is an example where an event in the supply chain can result in physical damages, physical loss of production, but without spreading from a cyber perspective. Yes, I do believe that looking at the third-party cyber risk posture, managing that, working with that third party to manage the risk downwards, to make that third party more resilient would have helped. And then, of course, real-world tabletop scenarios. What happens if my key supplier that provides, or maybe the only supplier that provides certain plastic parts, that could be big plastic parts in today's cars, cannot fulfill their requirements as far as production and delivery of parts is concerned. Last one, very close to home, Transnet declares force majeure after a ransomware attack. Now, the ransomware attack to many of us was probably no surprise, but I think the surprise for those that depended on Transnet to say the event of Transnet ports, all of them being closed at the same time for an indefinite period of time, is an absolute unthinkable event. And for that reason, I do give it a black swan status. Third-party cyber risk management would have confirmed probably that there are gaps in the Transnet cybersecurity posture. But I don't think anybody would have been able to do something, because that's the only ports in South Africa. If there's a single port, you can have a plan, right? When you have your tabletop scenarios, as I say, I give that a black swan. Okay, enough of going down the history. Let's look at what we can do. So third-party cyber risk management is currently very subjective, where we have an approach where we look at questionnaires, we do some on-site assessments, sometimes we even do penetration tests. These are kind of mostly annual. Once they've been done, the results are discussed with the supplier, and it is triaged and addressed. And then we have a period where we have no visibility until the next assessment is kicked off. And in today's fast-changing environment, that does not make sense. So what can we do? Right, we advocate a data-driven approach, and we use BitSight for that. So you can see this is a screenshot of a third-party portfolio, a demo portfolio in the BitSight platform. You can see that all these companies have security ratings, and also with a kind of minute trending graph there. So very much like your credit score. It doesn't depend on whether you paid all your bills this month, but is what have you done over the last 12 Apologies, we seem to have had a technical challenge. Hopefully, we're back online now. So, what I was saying is that why should we pay any attention to the security rating from BitSight? Now, the BitSight's security ratings have been independently verified, and mostly by the cyber insurance industry. Most recent one has been from Marsh McLellan, one of the largest global cyber insurance brokers, who compared the BitSight security rating with their own real-life cyber insurance claims and found that there's a good correlation between the BitSight security rating and the actual claims, essentially meaning that you've got a lower score, there's a better chance of having a cyber event and resulting in a cyber insurance claim. No surprise that Marsh McLennan then uses BitSight in their own operations, but so does the majority of the cyber insurance risk carriers, the reinsurers, and also major organizations in the financial and the investment industry, like Glass Lewis, who's not that well known in South Africa, but then also Moody's Investment Services. They both use, and others use BitSight internally in their reports and when they make investment decisions and give investment advice, to the extent that Moody's Investment Services invested $200 million in BitSight. So, as I say, behind this security rating, there is data. So it's pure data driven. It is not subjective, it's objective. Moment to look at the data. So there's over 120 data sources that's continuously collected. That's externally data sources. It's essentially available to any person out on the internet, including the threat actors. That is brought in and normalized and then associated and mapped to over 400,000 companies now. There is some human involvement to make sure that it's realistic. The human team is also involved in mapping the company. With some companies and groups have fairly complex group structures. And then eventually that is used to calculate 23 risk vectors. Now, of these 23 risk vectors, 27% is compromised systems. That is things like data breaches that has to be kind of notifiable data breaches, ransomware events, but also distributing malware, distributing spam, etc. 2.5% is user behavior, makes it almost insignificant. But in the latest version of the algorithm, just over 70% is diligence, cyber diligence. That is looking after, and you can see on the right-hand side, that's looking after your email configurations. That's looking after your certificates, your TLS configurations, your web application programs, the headers, open ports, patching, using supported software. All of that is important, and that is something that we can track externally for everybody in your supply chain. If you use BitSight, you're in good company. I already mentioned the cyber insurers, the reinsurers, the global brokers, but there's a couple of very nice logos there. A lot of the big names in the industry also use that rely on BitSight. And if you think, oh no, this is another learning curve for me that I need to kind of learn to get to use BitSight, the good news is that working with BDO, we management advisory service, where we use the platform and take care of the platform for you and help you with the process of selecting the vendors and keeping the vendors' cyber risk under control. Thank you very much. Any questions? We're going to do the questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Presentation mode.
Right, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, we've got a bit of a change in setup, so yeah, I'm just looking at the screen. I'm not really able to see what's behind me. So today I'm going to talk about some compliance, the favorite word for many people. I'm going to focus around the payment card industry and the data security standard in particular. I'm going to try and keep it fairly short and sweet. That is difficult when you talk about compliance, and it's even more difficult for me because I like to talk. But yeah, I'm going to try and keep it as quick as possible so that we can hopefully have some questions at the end, and we can address some of your well, concerns or any type of queries that you may have. Right, so starting with the various compliance standards. So the PCI Council is an organization that was formed originally by the biggest 5 payment brands. Namely, that was Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, or Dynas International as known in South Africa, and the Japanese Corporate Bank. Lately, the Chinese Union Pay has also joined these companies, but that was originally formed by the 5 companies. The various standards that form part of the PCI Council, there's quite a few standards. So that's why I said I'm going to focus on what we consider to be the main standard or the data security standard. The various people that have to conform to that standard, there's obviously the relevant banks and issuers, acquirers, etc. There's different processing companies. So for example, in South Africa, for a payment processing organization to have a license from the Payment Association of South Africa, you have to be PCI DSS compliant. And then there's different level of service providers and merchants. So I'm going to go talk about these in a bit more detail shortly, but just wanted to show you that there are various other standards that apply to some of those people that are not necessarily applicable to everybody, but it is very specific for whatever those companies are doing. Right. Then starting with PCI DSS. The PCI DSS consists of 12 major requirements or 6 goals or objectives. The intent of those requirements is to protect the credit card information and maintain the relevant controls that are in place to do so as business as usual. One thing about PCI DSS is that PCI DSS is an all or nothing standard. That means you're either 100% compliant or you're not compliant. So in terms of each one of the sections or the requirements, the major requirements, obviously different organizations have different systems in scope, different processes, and therefore some of those requirements may not be applicable to them. But generally speaking, most of those requirements are considered a minimum standard and therefore are pretty much applicable to most organizations. So starting with the various types of network security controls, protection of data, which is in transit as well as stored data, maintaining various types of vulnerability management programs, anti-malware, as well as patch management and application security, different application security best practices. Then the various access controls and identity management measures, and then finishing with the monitoring and testing of the various components, and obviously the various policies in place to govern all that. So this is in a nutshell what the various goals and objectives are. Again, there's two versions currently of the PCI DSS standards that are currently active. The version 3.2.1 was released in 2018, and it has been retired next year. So by the end of this year, or by end of March next year, we will no longer be able to use that version of the standards, and we'll have to move to the new version, which is version 4. But both of those standards do have 12 requirements. There are some differences between the two. I'll talk a lot about this in the next few slides. But bottom line is the objective or the intent of those is still the same: protection of credit card information, and obviously improving on those controls as business as usual principles. Okay, so in terms of applicability, I spoke about this. First of all, we need to understand what is considered account data. So account data or cardholder data typically includes the credit card number, the card name, expiration date, and then there's the sensitive authentication data, which is where typically you'll have the full track data, and you'll have the various PINs or card verification codes, and that's obviously subject to some additional requirements. Then I mentioned early on, that there are different types of organization that have to comply. So some of those organizations have different levels of compliance and different requirements that come with that. So in terms of service providers, there's different types of service providers. But bottom line is there's two levels there. There's level 1 and level 2. I've just put up on the slides level 1. So basically anybody with 300,000 annual transactions and more is subject to level 1 requirements. Level 1 requirements pretty much cover all 12 requirements, and they are subject to a third-party auditing by a qualified security assessor, or as we refer to, a QSA. Then in terms of the merchants, there's 4 levels of the merchants. There's always a question of who needs to do what in those levels. All those levels are defined based on the number of transactions. So that's how PCI defines the number, or the level of compliance required. I have put the various numbers on the slide, but in a nutshell, level 3 and level 4 are up to 1 million transactions, and level 1 and 2 is above 1 million. The difference between level 1 and level 2 is that level 1 has to be audited by a qualified security assessor. Level 2 may have to be audited depending on what is in scope. So for example, if there's an e-commerce site involved, then level 2 still needs to be audited by a third party or an internal security assessor. So that's in a nutshell some of the levels and requirements that come to the PCI DSS standards. So the cost of non-compliance, I think Ronnie mentioned Target early on. It's a very good example, so we all use it. I think the point here is that there are various costs associated with non-compliance, what we refer to as direct cost, and then the various types of tarnished reputation or essentially chain reaction type effect. So from a direct cost perspective, obviously the loss of productivity sales, the various compliance fines, insurance costs, lawsuits from different third parties, etc. All those are considered direct costs. The tarnished reputation, again, it's not something that we can necessarily put a number to, but I think some companies are fairly well aware of what that could cost them. And this is where I'll use the example of Target, where initially they started calculating the cost of their breach based on the direct cost, and then with time, they actually understood that there's a lot more to it in terms of long-term suffering of their brand, in terms of things like the share pricing, for example, dropped, and that had to recover over a number of years. So from starting with like $40 million cost, it worked out to be more than 200 at the end. And also in terms of downtime, the cost associated with downtime, some companies have it down to a specific number. Part of their risk strategy, but other companies still struggle to actually put a number to this. And it all boils down to understanding those risks and understanding the cost associated with that. And again, there are certain organizations that if they're not compliant, they cannot do business. So that's what we refer to the cost of to do business. And unfortunately, again, this is a reality. It happens all the time. So it's not something that we're not familiar with. There's quite a few companies that are very familiar with that. I have also used the example with Postbank. I'm sure we're aware that Postbank's been in the news a few times. And that all boils down to, again, some specific cost associated with their particular incident that they had. Right. So the question always is, where do we start? Okay. And how do we define the scope? So it all boils down to understanding your environment, understanding what's applicable, what's not applicable. With PCI, we always talk about systems in scope. And why is that? Well, because obviously it's much easier to limit the scope to only the systems that deal with cardholder data, and then focus on the controls around those systems, rather than having to implement and enforce controls throughout the entire environment. So this is where it's important to start looking at what is the different methods, acceptable methods of reducing scope, and understanding, again, what are the requirements. So most organizations will start with a self-assessment questionnaire just to try and put some form of readiness in terms of what they need to still do. A lot of other organizations engage immediately with professionals and specifically the QSAs in order to define the scope. And then based on that, we obviously start with putting some form of a gap analysis and understand what the various gaps are to achieve compliance. As I said earlier, it is 100% or nothing compliance. So unfortunately, if you do everything, but you're still 99% compliant, that means you're still not compliant. So part of that gap analysis and remediation process, typically, we would assist with the various challenges that organizations have, and also with interpretation of the standard. Yes, the standard is in English. However, it is in many, many cases subject to interpretation. And that is something that obviously many people that have had experience with PCI can assist with, but typically the appointed auditor is the one that will sign off on, which means typically that's where you want to get some form of approval or understanding of what the potential problem may be. Okay. And then in terms of the, once you've done all this work, all this remediation work, and you're ready for the audit, that's where typically the assessment happens. And again, the assessment is focused around the in-scope systems. So it's not going and just assessing the entire environment. It is assessing the systems that are identified as part of the various cardholder data flows. Yes, there are potential scenarios where one would not disclose some of that information, and as auditors, it's impossible to go and check every single aspect of that. This is why after an audit, the final result is a report on compliance and another document called attestation of compliance. And the attestation of compliance is where everybody, it's a legal document, everybody attests that information that's provided is true, and obviously they accept the accountability behind it. These are the acronyms at the bottom, AOC and ROC, that's what this stands for. AOC is the attestation of compliance, and ROC is a report on compliance. Okay, part of this process, we always also recommend something that PCI has, or the council has come up with, and it's called prioritized approach. So this is in essence a document which drives this in terms of going through the various controls. There's some milestones that are defined in the approach, and obviously each one of those milestones put some prioritization on the table in terms of what are the first things one would need to do in order to protect the card information as quickly as possible. But also it gives you a roadmap. So it gives you something to work with in terms of measurement, something to work with in terms of understanding what follows next. Okay. And again, obviously, if you have if you need to comply with the standard, and if you have some serious gaps, those may require some financial and operational planning. So, you may have to budget for that for the following year or for the following cycle. So with that in mind, this is where typically that information comes from. And again, this document is provided by the council, which means it is consistent among all the assessors and the various payment brands in terms of reporting. So if one wants to know what is the status of somebody's compliance, typically that will be the document that will be used to show that compliance. Right, then I spoke about the different versions of PCI standard. So these are the timeframes. As you can see, version 4 was released in 2022. This year, both standards are essentially in place, and you can choose which one to audit against. So that's what we call the transition period. And then up until 31st of March 2024, when version 3.21 will be retired. At that point in time, anything going further will have to be done against version 4. On top of that, some of the PCI DSS version 4 requirements are future dated. What does that mean? That means that they are considered best practice until the 31st of March 2025. The reason why the council's done that is to give people time to actually put those controls in place. Some of those controls are not that difficult to implement, but some of those could be quite challenging. So that's why it's important to have enough time, first of all, to understand those controls, but also to be able to implement them properly. Okay, so this is the timelines. A lot of people asking about that, so I think this gives a good indication of what lays ahead. Right, now let's talk quickly about PCI DSS 4. So first of all, the main difference between the two standards is that PCI DSS 4 now allows for two different types of approach of assessment. So up until version 4, all the previous versions only allowed for what we call the defined approach, typical auditing approach where you have your requirements, you have your definition of what the various controls should be and the various required testing procedures. And that's pretty much the template. That's pretty much what we need to do to become compliant. With version 4, the council's now introduced something called the customized approach. The customized approach is a very good concept. It obviously allows for some additional flexibility. However, it also requires a lot more work. So although people were very excited initially and saying, yes, no, we're going to use customized approach, it's definitely not as easy as we all thought it's going to be initially. So it does take a lot of work to be able to do the customized approach. So in that context, most organizations still keep using the defined approach, even with version 4. You can use combination of the two, but again, obviously that's something that takes a lot of planning and definitely understanding of what are the potential requirements that will require this customized approach. Okay, then the next requirement, so risk assessment. So the risk assessment has always been a requirement from a PCI perspective, but it was never defined to the degree which is now defined in version 4. Also with version 4, we now introduce something called targeted risk assessments, which makes sense. Typically, risk assessment would have been any risk assessment done in the organization, and we can say, yep, we've done an assessment. But how is that applicable to the various systems, or how is that applicable to the specifics of PCI? Well, it wasn't necessarily applicable. So now we've got the target risk assessments, which each one of those will have its own role and its own area of focus. Right, in terms of accountability. So accountability, again, has always been a big thing about any compliance, I suppose, from a PCI perspective. However, now there's a lot of emphasis on roles and responsibilities being defined, not just between third parties and the organization, but also internally between the various divisions or various departments. A huge focus on that. So every single one of the 12 requirements now has a specific request to have those defined. In terms of accountability, we also, there's different types of matrices, different types of access governance controls, etc., that also need to be now put in place. for example, quarterly access checks in terms of who's got privileged access, etc. Now that wasn't there before, or not as defined, so now it's all being defined as part of the new version. Web application protection. So in the past, when we spoke about web application, there was a few requirements, predominantly around the testing of the application and application security. And then there was one requirement on 3.21, which was pretty much focusing around web security and the use of technologies such as WAF and different types of web vulnerability scanning. With the new version, WAF is no longer optional. WAF will be required. There's also a lot of additional requirements that are now coming to place in terms of the various testing of APIs, in terms of the various testing of and understanding the various scripts that run on the various web applications or websites. For obvious reasons, a lot of the e-commerce applications have been exploited in the past few years, and needless to say, they are a huge target for many of the bad guys. Why? Because obviously by exploiting one single site, you can get a lot more data than having to go and physically hack a machine or try and copy cards in a store. Right, in terms of authentication, a lot more focus around the authentication. Password management has some improvements, obviously comparing to the older version of standard. And again, multi-factor authentication is now required for the entire environment. Previously, that was a requirement only for remote access and non-console access. Now it's required for the entire environment. So again, making those controls a little bit more defined and obviously clarified and also enforceable is what we're looking for. Testing, there's now one major change in the new version, and that refers to authenticated scans. So previously, all scans could be non-authenticated. Now, for technical people, you'll probably understand what the difference is. I'm not going to go into this now. The end result is that you will find a lot more vulnerabilities when you do an unauthenticated scan. And as much as it sounds like a small thing, in a large organization, that's a huge challenge. And that's why implementing that new control will take a fair amount of time. So therefore, it does require planning. Okay, training, there's a lot more focus on the security awareness training and specifically on testing, on simulation, on phishing and social engineering activities. That is now a requirement. Previously, it was quite generic security awareness training. And service provider management, third-party management, that's always been there. Again, there's some clarifications around that now. Okay, so what is the quick plans that we need to put in place? Again, clarify your scope. Try and simplify the scope as much as possible. What does that mean? If some processes or data does not belong in scope, remove it. Simple as that. Develop a plan. So have a proper plan developed. It does take a lot of planning. It does take a lot of time to be compliant and maintain compliance. So this is, for us, always key. And we always try and explain to people that, you have to have a good plan. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to maintain this. And then the validation of the controls. A lot of people do the policies. They implement some systems, but they never actually confirm that those controls are working and that the policies are being implemented correctly. So unfortunately, there will be a lot more focus on that for these organizations, and therefore they may end up failing their compliance due to that. All right, very quickly again, the achieving compliance is always the first step. So your initial compliance assessment is probably the easiest PCI assessment that you'll do. Why? Because initially all the controls, whatever they are, the requirements are, they may be quarterly requirements or annual or biannual or monthly. We're always going to require a single evidence for all of those. However, the moment you start maintaining the compliance, we now have to maintain, if it's a quarterly requirement, we have to maintain, 4 different evidences for whatever the requirement is, being a scan or a specific report or, whatever the requirement is. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations are still failing to understand that. They're still going ahead with, oh no, that's an audit. So, we'll do it once a year and, once a year we'll have the controls and we'll worry about it then. It's too late. So some of the stats from the council that was published, I think, a year or two ago, is that more than 44% of the companies do not maintain compliance. And that's for this particular reason. There's always the push of being compliant, then you become compliant, and then you just don't follow through. So the whole point is business as usual. This is what those controls should be. The compliance maintenance has to be built in into the operational aspect of one's organization. It's not a once-off exercise. Okay. Right. I'm trying to speed up a little bit. So in terms of the compliance maintenance, again, having a proper sustainable program is key. Maintaining the various policies, procedures, having the relevant metrics to measure the performance and to be able to say this works, this is in place, it's working. And again, ownership, and especially when it comes to accountability, we need to make sure that top management fully understands that the ownership is still with the top management. It's not a IT responsibility. It's not an operational responsibility. It is company's business responsibility, and therefore C-level responsibility and accountability has to be in place. And then maintaining the various other controls. I'm not going to go through all of those. They're on the screen, but bottom line is, I've repeated that a few times now, we need to build all those controls as the day-to-day operational tasks. Okay, and then these are just some supporting documents which are available on the PCI website. Typically under the document library, there's a lot of documentation. So one would need to know what you're looking for. But the whole point is it's a central location where the council has all the information. For those of you that are interested more in the topic, obviously we'll open the Q&A now, and then we'll see if and what you may have in mind that it's not clear for you. So, any questions? Not sure if and how I'm going to hear that, but
yeah, unfortunately, we don't seem to have any questions. I suppose then everyone has got a firm grasp on PCI DSS. Hopefully none of you in this specific session are in that 44% of non-compliant organizations. But yeah, it seems like we don't have anything at the moment. If there is something maybe later on as we go along, then we can pass it on. I actually have a question though, in terms of the PCI DSS, in terms of, let's say, one of those 44% non-compliant entities. To what extent and how much effort and cost do you find that it normally takes within our region to become fully compliant, or to become at a set to get to a satisfactory level?
So it's not a straightforward answer, for the simple reason that, as I said earlier, it's all about scope. So it's not about the size of organization. You may have a huge organization and then there's only one system in scope, and therefore, everything else is irrelevant. Well, not irrelevant, but from a PCI compliance perspective, it's not applicable. So the typical scenario is that, first of all, depending on if the organization is what we consider merchant or what we consider service provider, the level of effort with merchants typically is smaller because they rely a lot more on service providers. Having said that, the accountability still remains with the merchant. So as much as a lot of companies say, and my favorite one is, oh no, we've got a website, but we've got a service provider that's looking at our website, so it's not my problem. Well, it is absolutely your problem. The fact is, you need to ensure that your website is still secure. You need to ensure that your service provider that you chose to process my cardholder data is compliant. So I'm giving you my data. It's not about I'm giving it to a third-party provider. So that is always, again, a bit of a challenge to understand the standard and what's relevant and what's applicable to one's organization. It is the reason why we keep encouraging people. We do various workshops and different types of sessions, training awareness, etc., for that particular reason, because people still trying to sort of interpret what they see, and unfortunately 9 out of 10 they'll interpret it the way that suits them, and that's a challenge.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Simeon. We at the point in our schedule where we scheduled a 5-minute break. So, and just on time, even with some of the difficulties we had earlier. So we will return in 5 minutes. So 10 past 10. So if you want, you can, body break, get some coffee, and we'll be back in 5 minutes.
Press. Okay, I literally just use the mouse and click it. Oh, it's fucking like it. But I automatically just
Okay, we are back. It's 10 past 10 now. We still have 2 speakers to go. Next up will be Ryan from Darktrace. He'll be speaking on trending topics, Africa 2023. We in the same room, so if you see me looking up and looking to my left, I'm actually looking to one of the speakers. Just getting ready. Okay. There you go. Okay. Yep, over to you, Ryan.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you guys all virtually today. Yeah, looking forward to the next 20, 25 minutes. It's not the first time I'm speaking about cybersecurity to execs who don't know much about cybersecurity. So we'll make it a little bit fun. But for the most part, yeah, just looking forward to the session. If you guys have some questions, just obviously let me know, and we'll do a couple of minutes at the end just for some generic Q&A. I'm going to use the clicker now. Obviously, the clicker's not working. Yeah, let's go traditional, move a slide deck like that. Come on.
Yeah, I think you'll just have to.
There we go. I'm actually in many a times clicking and worked. But yeah, so guys, just introduce myself. So I'm the account exec here at Darktrace. So if anybody you guys know Darktrace, we are affiliated, if any of you guys watch F1, so some of you do, we are affiliated with the McLaren brand. So that's sort of a good and a bad thing. People think we're as expensive as a McLaren, but actually we're somewhere in the middle. But yeah, it really helps us get our word across to people that maybe aren't in tech and IT. But today, yeah, I'll be speaking primarily around training attack techniques that I've seen personally with customers, with people the last couple of months, and it's becoming really interesting, becoming a lot more sophisticated. And yeah, just I wanted to point out one or two for you guys to see yourselves. As much as you might not be in IT, it might be managing to get to your inbox at some point. So yeah, just a brief on Darktrace. I've got this little 5-second video clip. Oh, there it works. But primarily, Darktrace has just pioneered AI in cyber. That's effectively our claim to fame. And we were actually founded by mathematicians from Cambridge. And they decided to look, instead of addressing the problem purely from what's been, what the approach has been for the last, 20 years since cybersecurity started, we just flipped the conversation around and said, look, let's focus on users, let's focus on behaviors, as opposed to just understanding what's happened in the past and then trying to predict what might come. So and also the founding of these mathematicians, Darktrace is able to build an algorithm to really understand you, understand every single user, every single device. And with that in question, Darktrace is able to identify something strange about you if there is an attacker that manages to get into your network or your infrastructure. So basically, we just, a bunch of smart mathematicians out in Cambridge building out these algorithms to try predict what the next attack vector might look like. But yeah, as I said before, guys, if you guys just watch F1, you will notice that Darktrace is affiliated with McLaren. If you guys are an F1 fan. So just moving on. So literally, just to reignite what I just said, we've got more than 2,000 employees globally, of which we've got quite a big offering here in Johannesburg. But just to reiterate, we've just been the ones that's pioneered AI in cyber. That's been our claim to fame, and that's very much still what we do today. And we're based in the UK, and we've got a good couple of thousand customers across the globe. But actually in South Africa as well as Africa, we've got quite a few. Maybe some of you guys already on the call might have seen or used Darktrace in the past. But yeah, as I opened up this conversation, why should business leaders care about cyber? Why should execs care about cyber? I think I should rephrase that question. Why should business leaders care about improving their cybersecurity posture? A couple of guys earlier today actually mentioned some significant attacks that happened in the past. I'm going to just sort of touch on some of them. But these are some of the use cases that usually you guys, as yourselves, not being necessarily in IT, might have been exposed to in the past. We understand that ransomware will affect everyone, right? But primarily from an exec perspective, I think the core concerns are around business continuity, right? If I can't sell my product, if I'm offline and my customers are unhappy, that has a direct impact on revenue. Okay, so that's monetarily, right? But in terms of, I mean, just in South Africa, specifically in the last couple of years, there was a massive incident with one of the healthcare providers. As much as it's a monetary impact in terms of what ransomware entails, unfortunately, in that case, it was actually people that were affected in terms of procedures were being delayed at this particular hospital group. People couldn't be invoiced, supplies couldn't be paid. The fact that, like, let's say if you had an operation, there was delays in your operation. If you've got things like cancer, like, again, it just speaks to the fact that, cybersecurity and cyber and ransomware specifically is not an IT person's problem. It's literally impacting people's lives. Also, things around business email compromise. If somebody steals your password and pretends to be you, can you imagine the damage they can cause? In terms of CFOs, for example, if I come in and I manage to steal the password of one of your finance people and ask the CEO to make a payment to a different account, it's quite as easy as that. So my suggestion is just ensure you guys are changing your passwords as often as possible, but primarily just keep a lookout for those links that come through your email before obviously looking at things like making payments without doing your validations, your checks. Also moving on to in terms of insider threat, right? It's very difficult to stop someone who's trusted with an organization from stealing a data or money or your intellectual property. It's very difficult. You can put controls in place. You can put barriers to entry. But what if somebody who's got the right admin credentials to get in and cause damage? It's very difficult to stop. So those are some of the things that we pointed out when building our dark traces, that as much as you can put trust and you can instill trust in every single person, it's very difficult to sorry, just 1 second, to trust every single person in your organization, especially when there's competitors coming around, asking about specific IP. So that's also a concern that isn't necessarily an IT problem. Things like reputational damage. We've seen now with Poppy and the listed companies specifically having to disclose information about breaches immediately because of the new Poppy Act that was introduced a few years ago. So, like, I know personally, if I see one of my service providers in the news exposing my data, it does put a bitter taste in my mouth in terms of them not necessarily prioritizing my information, right? But also, I mean, businesses are sitting with some crucial information. Just the other day, I was applying for a home loan. The amount of data they've got on me right now, and I'm really hoping they are securing our information because there's obviously monetary values here involved. But the fact that if you're on the news, it does obviously impact ROI, impacts revenue directly, and we've seen this before. And just lastly, there's a whole bunch of other use cases, but just traditional theft. Somebody comes in and tries to hit you with a phishing email and asks you to make a payment to a different place. Happens all the time, and they're becoming a lot more difficult to pick up. And I'll show you guys a little bit later in terms of what that might look like. And just specifically to South Africa, I mean, I did some searching the other day, just in terms of the material impact of cyber. That figure might change, but in the last couple of years, I mean, just the last year itself, there was more than a 2 billion rand impact. South Africa alone, in terms of loss of revenue, sort of loss of income, reputational damage, and I'm sure that's a moving target, right? And that's just what's been disclosed. Imagine what hasn't been disclosed, the ones that have been put under wraps. So we are not, we're certainly a target in South Africa and Africa, apparently with, top 10 in the world in terms of ransomware. And according to the study, I think it was an IOL document that I read. Maybe don't quote me on that, but more than half of South African firms last year were impacted by ransomware of some sort, which is pretty incredible. The fact that that we are still an up and coming country in terms of infrastructure, internet, sort of market penetration on internet. The fact that more than half of maybe mid-sized firms have been impacted, that's quite profound. And then just lastly, in terms of what the industries that have been impacted, we only know of a few that are willing to disclose it, right? I mentioned healthcare before. It's obviously things like retail, financial services, and obviously government now. I think there's a unique problem with government at the moment. One of the chaps earlier mentioned Transnet, SASA as well. So the problem is not going to be going away. And my advice is just don't sort of ensure this is just an IT problem, because it's not. It impacts directly on revenue and impacts on your customers, as well as there's a direct impact on people, as I mentioned with that healthcare provider that happened a couple of years back. And one of the, as part of that same exercise that I was doing last week, there was a survey that was done, I think it was last year, more than 3,000 IT staff. And the survey was just around what are some of the unique problems that they've had, that they were exposed to, and why they were attacked. And there's sort of two key areas, right? And one of the standouts is just the fact that, you know, companies have existing vulnerabilities, and also no passwords were stolen, right? Those are the fundamental two problems. And I think if addressing vulnerabilities was easy, everyone would do it, right? You can patch, you can update as much as you possibly can. There's always going to be ways and means for somebody to bypass that. I know personally when my computer is updated, I get frustrated. So I think that's inherently, it's a human problem, right? Also, sometimes when updates are done on your software, there's sometimes compatibility issues. So let's say you update something in Microsoft, and all of a sudden Microsoft Word doesn't really match up with the version you've got. So there's a reason why it's quite difficult to ensure you guys are always updated all the time. I've spoken to companies many a time that were confident that because they had been patched and updated, that we wouldn't see anything, wouldn't find anything. And more often than not, there's always something that lingers around. So that problem is always going to be there. I would encourage you guys to ensure your staff are updating as much as possible, but just know it's not going to be a silver bullet, right? But also credentials, just traditional passwords. I know we all hate having 6, 7, 8 different passwords. It's not feasible sometimes, right? Is that your banking password is different to your medical aid password, which is different to, and then you forget and then you can't get in the first place. So that problem is going to be persisting. But just obviously, suggestion is just ensure you've got a very difficult password amongst all your applications that you use. But those are the two fundamental problems that's according to that survey in mid-sized companies. But as much as you can try, there's always going to be someone. There's always going to be someone that clicks on something. So having those controls, as much as they're great, and it makes it a lot more difficult to get into your environment, they're not bulletproof. So just to be made aware of those unique problems. So in terms of sort of why Darktrace, very, very briefly, we've just focused purely on understanding the unique behaviors of users, right? So we will understand each individual at a very granular level, day in, day out. We'll understand who you interact with, who you communicate with, who you email. The whole point is this algorithm is learning you, and it's trying to understand if something doesn't belong. If there is a link that's received, or if there's a payment that's supposed to be made, and that's not necessarily how we've seen you in the past, that's what we've been focusing on. In the case of what I spoke about before, you know, picking up on vulnerabilities and stolen passwords, we'll be able to recognize that shift where somebody may be coming from a different time of day or different device. Darktrace will pick up on those weaknesses that you have and preempt somebody trying to exploit that. But yeah, just swiftly moving on to some of the things that I've seen actually very recently. I'd love this to be a bit more interactive, but I think just in terms of logistics, it's quite difficult. But I actually showed this to my colleague yesterday. This is actually a phishing email. And I encourage you guys to figure out how this is different, specifically to this Maybank T or 2u.com. I couldn't figure it out. I generally thought it was a mistake, but there actually is something different. And if you're just answering an email, just clicking on a link because it looks legitimate, it's not. In the case of these two examples, can you see the characters are slightly changed? Maybank, this A symbol looks different to that A symbol, and sort of the same with Citibank. that is a fish, and it's incredibly difficult to look out for that. So just be aware, and that's just one of the techniques I've seen personally where it's very difficult to spot. So just read an email twice sometimes to see who the sender is coming from. And also something I've seen also personally myself is everyone loves to click on unsubscribe. I do it personally almost every second day with some sort of spam newsletter that's coming through that I didn't necessarily sign up for. The ploy that these guys are using now is that they are persistently trying to get you to click unsubscribe, which is obviously what we would do, right? To ensure that that annoying person is going to leave us alone. But what's embedded in that link is something malicious. And then what it'll do in this case, this is what it looks like, is it'll show you maybe a fake Google single sign-on page or Microsoft single sign-on page to force you to share your credentials. But like that's a ploy that I've personally seen, and it's becoming more and more pertinent. So just sort of just look again. If you're seeing that unsubscribe link, just be very careful before you start putting your credentials in to unsubscribe for a newsletter that you ordinarily this could be malicious. So yeah, just warning on those two examples. And also, I mean, this is maybe not new, but this is a problem that's certainly persisting and becoming more of a problem. It just speaks to the fact that keep your credentials safe, keep them difficult to obtain. In this case, if there's an attacker that's going to steal one of your passwords, which is very plausible, as I said, keeping your passwords difficult and different and updating them all the time is sometimes actually just not feasible because you can forget your own password. Attackers are looking out for that. And once they've logged into your mailbox or to one of your user accounts, once they're in, they can pretend to be you. And they can pretend to be a finance admin in this case, trying to ask the CFO to change the banking details of the supplier that you're looking to pay the invoice at month end. So just watch out, be very cautious of these techniques. Like the fact that he's in your environment and pretending to be somebody trustworthy, just keep an eye on these ones. It's very, very difficult to pick up because there's nothing malicious. Once they're in, there is no link here. There's no attachment here. There's just somebody asking to please change the banking details to a different place, which happens. I've seen it personally myself. Just watch out. Just focus on those sort of, obviously, if you're a CFO and you're making payments or you're somebody in procurement, just triple check where the destination is. If there's a change in banking details, obviously go through multiple validations to ensure that it's legitimate. And I'm assuming at least a few of you people, and maybe in finance, would have seen this before. But to reiterate, there is nothing malicious. There's no link here. There is no attachment here. There's nothing malicious. It's just somebody pretending to be someone they're not and asking you to change the account details to a different account. Happens all the time. And this is one of the techniques that I've seen personally as well. Yeah, I think pretty much on my side, guys, I'm done. If you've got a comment or question, just let me know. But yeah, I hope you guys sort of enjoyed what we chatted about today.
Thanks. I don't see any questions. And for those of you that do watch F1, if you haven't seen Dark Trace, McLaren's currently sitting sixth in constructors, so you'll see them a lot at the front of the grid.
Yeah, I've noticed that. I've stopped watching for a while, actually.
But they are there. I actually have a question. How are you seeing a lot of deepfake enabled attacks at the moment?
I think
in Africa, particularly.
I think so. Where we're coming from, we're looking at from like a network and email perspective. So that's quite difficult. Where we're seeing is the generative AI. That's the next thing. Is where ChatGPT is going to go against you, and it's going to so we've built out these new models to cater for that sort of thing. But yeah, like these with the likes of ChatGPT, they can hit you guys at scale without needing to know much. So that's prevalent, and that's very much a topic of conversation for us internally. And we're seeing it with our customers that it's just to do something at scale at machine speed now, where it ordinarily would take an attacker quite a while to build something crafted for a particular person, but now they can do it at scale. So I'd say I'm more concerned about that personally from a dark trades perspective, but I'm assuming, yeah, deep fake certainly as well.
Yeah. No, I also see a lot of
Hmm.
fraud, mostly being done through phishing. But yeah, you can't even be careful with a phone call from your CEO because you don't know if it is your
Yeah.
CEO these
And I've
days.
seen it personally when somebody was, oh, it's called phishing, on their phone and they pretend to be someone they're not. I've seen it many times without dark trace actually involved whatsoever. So yeah, I think yeah, thanks everyone for the time, and if you got any questions, just shout. Okay.
Yep. Okay. Okay, next up we have Nick Osborne from INSEOX. And Nick will be our final speaker of this event. So please, again, if you do have any questions, do drop them in the chat or in the Q&A.
Check is this clicker.
How we click on this user.
So I've shifted. Right. So good morning, everybody. Shannon, I'm Nick Osborne from INSEOX. So today I just want to take you through our data-driven, risk-based approach to managing cyber risk. As we've heard, in the sessions before, and as I'm sure we have in terms of our experiences in our business, our business are generating vast volumes of data. We also have access to vast volumes of data that are sitting outside of our business, and it's about bringing those data sets together to enable us to target and manage the cyber risks to our business. So yeah, so we've heard a lot of examples this morning around cyber breaches. We've had the Target, we had the Maersk. I think more recently, last week, we heard about the Development Bank of South Africa that was subject of a ransomware attack. And not only did they have a ransomware attack where their data, their systems, their log files, and that were encrypted, but they also suspect that data was exfiltrated from their network. So effectively, it's a double blow for their organization. It's a and there's no guarantee that even with the ransomware, if they paid it, that their data would be decrypted, and likewise that personal data that's been exfiltrated is sitting in marketplaces waiting for the highest bidders. So on the screen here, also you'll see that there's some comments that we hear around the boardrooms, and I'm sure some of these will probably resonate with yourselves in some of the conversations that you're having in your offices, in your excos, and in your board meetings. Something just to kind of point out is that recently the World Economic Forum have listed their top 10 global risks, and cyber crime and cyber security is listed as one of the top 10 risks that are going to have the most impact on us over the next 10 years. So this problem certainly isn't going away. So within our businesses, we exist as a business to create value, and we create that value for our customers, for our shareholders, and other stakeholders. And to build that value, we put in place processes, we use technologies, we hire people, and we put governance structures in place to ensure that we have the best of breed and can protect ourselves as best as possible. Cyber threat actors, of course, they're looking to leverage that value that we build They're looking to access our data. They're looking to compromise our systems, to disrupt our operations. And in doing so, they erode the very business value that we are trying to create, and that we're also trying to protect. So, yeah, how do they do that? Well, they're constantly looking for vulnerabilities. They're looking for vulnerabilities in our people. So we've heard in previous sessions, targeting with phishing attacks, phishing, things like that. We've got process vulnerabilities. A simple example, leavers processes. How many times do we hear that there's some disgruntled employee that's left the organization, but their access wasn't terminated in a timely manner, and they've managed to access the networks after the event? Our technologies, we implement a lot of technologies that enable and add value to our businesses, but often if these aren't configured properly, they create vulnerabilities that can be exploited. So just something else to touch on there. So what also has exacerbated the challenge for us is the expedition of digital strategies. So the likes of COVID-19 has allowed us to work remotely. It's allowed us to work from different places, sometimes around the world. And what this does, and what this has allowed, or has enabled us to adopt different technologies, new technologies, but at the same time, it's moving us out of our traditional comfort zone, which is typically a physical environment where we can control it ourselves, and it's nicely ring fenced. So those boundaries, those physical boundaries that we previously had, on not always there. So if we look at a typical cyber risk taxonomy, as I mentioned, there's threat actors. So these can be both internal or external to your organization. Now, these threat actors give rise to your threats to your organization. And what are they looking to do? They're looking to exploit these vulnerabilities. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, we got process, people, technology. They're looking and searching for those little vulnerabilities that they can exploit to get access to the data, or to encrypt our systems, to disrupt our business operations. So these threat actors that are looking to exploit vulnerabilities create risk to our business. They are creating risk to the very business value that we trade on in the market, with our customers, with our shareholders. These risks damage our assets. So within our business, we have hardware assets, we have IP assets, and we have financial assets. And of course, as a business, we want to protect those. So we are putting in safeguards and countermeasures to protect those assets from these risks. And that gives us, along with some management, we've got our second line risk and compliance functions, and we've got our third line internal auditors, external audits, and specialists that come in and give us assurance on those safeguards and countermeasures that we've put in place to protect these risks. And that gives us comfort that we protecting our business value. But given the complexity of the cyber risk landscape that we need to manage, it really needs to be driven by a data enabled, tech-enabled cyber risk management approach. So we can really understand and manage our cyber risk across this cyber risk taxonomy, from identifying threat actors, identifying threats in our organization, how they can be exposed to vulnerabilities, all the way through to our safeguards and countermeasures, and how effective they are working to protect our assets against those risks that are going to directly impact our business value. So how do we do this? So firstly, there's a 3 R's approach: reprioritize, the refocus, and reform. Right? So reprioritize. So what do we mean by that? So in our business, we typically collect a lot of dots. We've got a lot of technologies that generate log files. We've got systems that generate events. We've got access logs, and we leverage that as well as we can in order to make decisions that we believe are going to protect our business from these cyber risks. So what we need to do with reprioritizing is looking at all these dots, looking at what's available from external sources, connecting these dots together to help us to make deeper, more informed decisions around what are the risks that we need to manage, and how do we prioritize those to safeguard those that have the biggest impact on our business, on the business value that we build in. In having that, we reprioritize our resources to focus them in the areas that provide the greatest safeguards to protect against risk. And also we use that to harden the controls that we put in place to protect that value. So we had an example earlier around vulnerabilities with patch management. If there's assets in our organization that have significant business value and can bring our organizations to its knees, we need to ensure that the controls to protect that against these cyber risks that we've identified from our threats are effective. So refocus. So what are we saying here? So basically, as a business, we've got limited resources, particularly in the cyberspace where there's a shortage of skill sets. We need to be clear and focused as to where we put those resources, whether it's financial, whether it's human, whether it's technology, and it needs to be driven based on the business value that it's protecting. So it's around identifying your assets. So often within our organization, we have the assets that we know, but then there's also the assets that we don't know. And it's often those assets that we don't know that end up resulting in the compromises that diminish the business value that we're trying to protect. So it's really around widening that lens on the data that's available to surface the unknowns, make them known, and then allow us to refocus our efforts, our resources into the spaces that are going to protect those the best. Just an example there around incorporating other insights. So like we said, so outside of your typical data within an organization, you're accessing insights from external sources that can enhance and enrich the data that you have to make better decisions, to manage your cybersecurity risks in a more effective manner. So reform. So this is probably one of the more difficult components of the 3Rs, because this requires a change in the way the business thinks. It requires a top-down approach. It's about looking at how does the business do things differently? How do we tackle these problems differently? It's around looking at your policies and asking yourselves, are these policies adequate enough to protect our organizations from a dynamic change in risk landscape, cyber risk landscape? Does it create barriers? Does it create hurdles that reduce productivity within the organization? As a result, employees look to circumvent some of the policies that are put in place because they believe that it's going to reduce productivity. It's around taking a risk-based approach rather than compliance-based approach. Whilst compliance-based approaches have their place in the organization and they're non-negotiables, it's really around focusing your resources on the risks that create the greatest impacts to the erosion of your business value. So implementing a data-driven risk register. So in my experience, quite often, risk registers are created, they sit in a folder, and monthly or quarterly they get opened. There'll be some sort of updates to them in terms of some activities that have been done in order to be reported within the organization. How many times do these risk registers actually get really reviewed and scrutinized based on new data? What has changed in the environment? What are the new cyber threats that exist out there, and how is the organization protecting and mitigating them? So what we're really encouraging here is that the organizations leverage data to update and maintain their risk registers on, if possible, a real-time basis, given the nature of the cyber environment. But if not real-time, at least on a more regular basis, using data-driven insights. Perfect the basics. So as mentioned earlier, quite often it's the basics that we stumble upon. User passwords, vulnerabilities where patches exist, but the patches haven't been applied. Quite often, in my experience, you find those patches haven't been applied because the team or the people that are involved or responsible for doing that have other priorities. So they target some patches fail, but they don't get back to them. And quite often those are the ones that trip us up. The example I used earlier with leavers process, in theory, a very simple control in a business. So when somebody leaves, HR notifies IT and the account is terminated. Too often, I've seen instances where leaver accounts have not been disabled, IT have not picked them up, HR have not picked them up, and they've been sitting active on the network sometimes for months. I guess in some of those instances, they're fortunate because that hasn't been exposed, that vulnerability. But I've also seen instances in business where disgruntled employees have left and their access hasn't been terminated, and they've actually been able to access data that they shouldn't have and exfiltrated that. And that's caused great problems because it's personal crown jewel data. And then reform. So it's really looking at, well, all of these new insights that we've gathered, using a data-driven risk-based approach. How do we then build this tactical response plan that prioritizes what we're going to do, what business value we have to protect, we need to protect, and then using those resources that we have available, whether it's financial, whether it's people, whether it's technology, to ensure that we're protecting our business value as well as we can. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just open up to some questions.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, it seems like I think so early in the morning for people to be typing questions, but we don't have any. So yeah, look, I hope that everyone has enjoyed the event. We finished ahead of time. We still have plus minus 15 minutes or so to go. But yeah, I think everyone, every presentation was very interesting, and I hope that it's, got you thinking, that it's added some sort of seeds in your minds in terms of things that possibly can be done for your organizations, maybe for you personally as well. And yeah, I think I just want to thank each and every one of the speakers for taking time and presenting for each of our participants today. And I also like to thank each and every one of you participants for joining the event. And yeah, I think we'll share our details after this, so that if you have any queries or thoughts or anything any other information you'd like from any of the participants, any of the speakers, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. Will the recording of today's event be made available? Yes, it will be. Again, we'll just share that information after this. And yeah, there's no other questions, comments. I think we can close. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you to the speakers. Thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure. Bye, everyone.